The Book of Armagh is an incredibly important early Irish manuscript. It dates from the 9th century. We know the circumstances in which it was commissioned, so we know quite a lot about it. We know the name of the principal scribe, a man named Ferzovnach, which literally means sort of man of the church. And it also contains really fascinating contents. So not only is it important as a manuscript in its own right, it's also incredibly important in terms of the material that it contains. Now, the reason this facsimile is so important is, a manuscript, unlike say a print book, a manuscript will be a single item. So there is only one Book of Armagh. It's currently in Trinity College in Dublin. It's an extremely valuable manuscript. So in the normal course of events, a researcher or even a member of the public wouldn't really have an opportunity to study or look at the Book of Armagh. But in this facsimile, which was produced in 1937, Gwyn brought together the texts related to St. Patrick, which form one of the foundational areas of subject matter within the actual manuscript. And for very many decades, this was the main way that scholars were able to access the material easily and also to teach the material to classes. So it's really only with the rise, I suppose, of digitization and the ready availability of many medieval manuscripts online. So for example, this manuscript, Manuscript 52, can be accessed on the Trinity College Digital Library Collection. It can also be accessed in another fantastic site from the Royal Irish Academy, the confessio.ie. But say, for example, when I started off on my research, those sites didn't exist. And I wasn't able to go up to Trinity to access the manuscript at all times. So really, you're relying on this facsimile as the main way that you could look at the manuscript. One of the interesting aspects of the Book of Armagh is that it contains a multitude of different texts, different genres, but they're all related together in this sort of overarching sort of narrative about Patrick. So it's roughly divided into three. The first section of the manuscript contains texts related to Patrick. So these range from Patrick's own writings, and that's my main area of interest when I'm looking at the Book of Armagh. So these writings date from the 5th century. It then has lives written about Patrick in the 7th century, and the Patrick we think of now is essentially the 5th century Patrick interpreted by the 7th century writers. And in the Book of Armagh, the 7th century writers come first and Patrick's own writings come last. So by the time you read Patrick, you've already got the interpretation that's been put into place. And then there's also other texts of various dates which put Armagh at the centre of Patrick's story. So that's the first section of the Book of Armagh. And it's this part, I suppose, which is probably the most famous among scholars and historians, because it's really sort of the treasure trove for understanding the story of Patrick in Ireland and how it was interpreted and how the church grew over time. It also contains a full copy of the New Testament, and it contains the life of a really famous continental saint, St. Martin of Tours. And so what the manuscript as a whole is doing is it's placing Patrick in the context of the apostles of the New Testament and also one of the great saints on the continent. So what you're getting from the Book of Armagh is a really interesting, I suppose, cultural package in which a lot of different things are going on, and there's a whole series of layers. And when I think of the manuscript, I like to think of it as having three different layers. One is the layer from the 5th century, Patrick's own genuine writings, then a layer from the 7th century, when the idea of Patrick as the Apostle of Ireland takes up and becomes interpreted. And then there's a layer in the 9th century when this is all put together and placed within the context of Armagh being the most important church in Ireland. So that's quite a lot going on in a single manuscript. I think one way to think about it maybe more practically and get a sense of how these layers are intersecting is to think about how women in society are portrayed in each one of these different layers. For someone like myself who's working on the early social history of Ireland, texts are very few and far between before the 7th century really. And one of our most important written sources are the writings of Patrick. And this is one of the ways that I've come to use the Book of Armagh, because it contains a copy, the earliest surviving copy of one of the two texts that Patrick wrote. This is the text known as the Confessio, or the Confession. And the version of the Confession in the Book of Armagh has been slightly edited to put Patrick in a better light, because the Confession is in many ways quite an honest document in terms of Patrick's, I suppose, experiences in Ireland, his experiences of Christian conversion, and his experiences of Irish society. And one of the things that I started looking at in my own research is the extent to which Patrick can give us a snapshot of how Irish society is working on the ground. It's easy maybe to be overly schematic about how society operates, but what Patrick is giving us is one person's interpretation of their experiences within that society. And what's absolutely exciting about this as well is we can also look at other texts and artifacts from the period, and we can see how Patrick and what he says actually makes sense of that reality. Now, one of the really striking things about the Confession and Patrick's story about, I suppose, his narrative about his experiences in Ireland is the extent to which women are completely central to the success of his mission. And he mentions women at several key points throughout the story. So I suppose just to give a sort of a basic context to this, the Confession is really Patrick explaining a little bit about his early life, how he came to be a slave in Ireland, and then how he was inspired to return to Ireland as a missionary. But in order for his mission to be successful, he had to rely on people within Irish society supporting him and buying into his message. And one group that seems to have bought in more significant numbers, I would think, relatively speaking, one group is women, and women of all social classes. And that's really the fascinating thing about what the Confession shows us. So Patrick depicts a society which is very hierarchical. So on the one hand, you've got kings and nobles, which he mentions. You've got learned professionals that he mentions as well. Then you have a sort of a class of what we might describe as, I hate using the term ordinary people, but we'll just use that for the moment. And then you've got people who are slaves. Some of these slaves, like Patrick, are of British origin, others would have been of Irish origin. And Patrick is really aware of how status works within that society, and it comes across in a number of different passages in the Confession. So, for example, he refers to slave women as being among the most important of his followers, not only because they give an example to other Christians through their sort of heroic adoption of Christianity, but because they hold on to their Christian belief despite the fact that they're persecuted. So he makes, this for him is really important. And as you can imagine from Patrick, as somebody who himself had also been a slave, you can see how that would have been a resonance. But, it's slave women he refers to, not slave men. He then refers to sort of the intergenerational conflict that comes with Christianity. So you've got children sort of against their parents, the parents holding to the older ways, the children converting. And when he wants to give an example of these intergenerational conflicts, again, he highlights women. Now, we can think of practical reasons for that. Women, because of their role within the kindred, within the extended family, often have really important bonds across generations. So they're very important in how Christianity expands, and we see this elsewhere. So when we look at conversion in the Roman Empire, women again are extremely important. And his only physical description of an Irish convert in all of his writings is of an Irish woman, a noble Irish woman who gets a message from God and dedicates herself as a virgin to the church. And again, it really stands out because Patrick often will speak in generalities. So he'll say, the sons and daughters, nobles, slaves. But in this case, he gives a particular instance. And my absolutely favourite story in all of Patrick's writings it's one which is in the Confessio. And he describes how he's at the altar and that women who women who are there. He doesn't describe the setting, so it could be an outdoors altar, for example. It's not necessarily in an ecclesiastical building, and that they are throwing gifts, pieces of jewellery onto the altar. And you can imagine these maybe as dress pins, the types of artifacts that survive from that period. And Patrick is sort of going, no, don't do this, because this is maybe not a good idea. And it's a really fantastic example of cultural misunderstanding, because we know from other sources that one way that the native Irish, before the coming of Christianity, would show their devotion to a particular, I suppose, deity, supernatural force, whatever you want to call it, was by depositing objects. And you can see them depositing objects on the altar. Patrick is misinterpreting it as maybe having some sort of sexual connotation, which he's not keen on, at least the way he presents it anyway. So again, we get this snapshot. It's the only point in all of Patrick's writings where he describes being at an altar with a congregation. So, if you look across all of the things that Patrick has written, women are completely central. The only believer that he describes in detail as a woman, the only experience of sort of maybe a liturgical or mass gathering again is of women. So they're obviously completely central to the success of his mission. And he's interested in women at all of those different social levels, whether they're slaves or whether they're aristocrats. So that comes across very strongly in reading that document. Now, as I mentioned earlier with the Book of Armagh, the writings about Patrick are the last section of the texts that are devoted to St. Patrick. And the earlier texts are actually ones that were written later about him. And when we go to them, there's two lives written in the 7th century. And the opening text in the Book of Armagh is a life of Patrick written by Muraku. He's a cleric writing towards the end of the 7th century. And what he does is he's taking Patrick's writings and he's creating a story that will be meaningful to a changed society. And in that changed society, the idea of women being central to the conversion narrative is not something that he accepts. So they go completely into the background. And if you read through Muraku's text, there are hardly any references to women at all in the entirety of the text. When they do appear, it's in relationship to men and it's in supporting roles. So we get nothing like the equivalent of what Patrick presents us with in the Confession. So for Muraku, it's about the kingship of Ireland. It's highly political. It's the role of the Church of Armagh. And in that very political narrative, men are central and women are peripheral. So they completely fall out of the picture. Now, the other life I will give an honourable mention to, the life by Tyracon, written a little bit before the life by Muraku. He's a bishop, probably based in Connacht. And he does have one section where he describes the conversion of the daughters of the King of Ireland. And it's probably one of the most memorable sections in his life because they ask Patrick, they try to understand Jesus as if he was a noble Irishman. So they ask Patrick about, what's his family like? Was he fostered out as a child? And then they decide that, they don't want to stay in this life any longer. So they get baptized, receive communion and die, which is quite a kind of not common narrative trope that you get in some of these texts. So, it's again with Tyracon, he's drawing on a range of different traditions. That story about women stands out, but they're noble women. The narrative is really about their death and explaining their burial, an object on the landscape. It's not about the women themselves. So even though we can say more about women in his text compared to Muraku's, there's no doubt, but they've become far less central than they were in Patrick's own narrative. When I'm thinking about the Book of Armagh and the texts within it, I have my own particular angle. It's fitting into a project that I'm working on. But there's many other different ways that you could look at it. I mean, it could be examined in terms of the manuscript itself, the history of manuscript production. It could be looked at in terms of the growth of the Irish Church, the history of Armagh. I mean, there's so many different ways that these can be approached. And one thing I would add to this as well is that the production of these facsimiles was very close to the heart of the founder of the Irish Manuscripts Commission, Owen MacNeill. And in fact, when MacNeill was on his deathbed, the last thing he wrote was a quote from the life of Patrick in the Book of Armagh, and in a way that shows the extent to which those sources and the availability of those sources was something that was really central to him and to his life.